Welcome to the lecture on policy making. This visual outlines how the varying levels of our government affect one another and interact with each other in order to influence and or implement our social welfare policies. There are four main actors involved in the US policymaking process. You have legislators in the House and the Senate. You have those that are in the executive branch, which would be the president and cabinet agencies. You have the judicial branch, which would be federal district courts, federal appeals courts, and the US Supreme Court. And then you have those individuals involved in outside interests, such as lobbyists, advocacy organizations, and individual members of the public. There are several different types of policy instruments. For example, we have what you're probably more familiar with in terms of the law, which would be a product of legislation. We have regulations, which are involved in implementing specifics. There are budgets, which are involved in spending and taxing. And you have agency administration of law or program authorized by legislation. And then finally, court decisions. As you'll see here, there are 5 phases of policy development and implementation. It begins with agenda setting and problem definition, goes on to identification of alternatives, a selection of policy, then phase 4 goes into implementation, and then finally evaluation and feedback. These activities obviously involve many factors, and it's important to know that at each phase, there are opportunities for input and advocacy. There are multiple advocacy activities that are possible in terms of affecting policy making. There is contacting a legislator or legislative committee. You can write a letter or call. You can write a letter to a newspaper or op-ed. You can join an organization that focuses on your concern and which engages in advocacy. You could form a coalition or get involved with forming a coalition with other interested parties. You could submit a written testimony, testify at a hearing. You could submit comments on proposed regulations. You could even research, write, and disseminate a policy brief. And finally, you could cultivate relationships with legislative staff in hopes of influencing some of the decisions made. One of the benefits of being in a more technologically savvy community, as well as likely technologically savvy generation, is that there are now new options for advocacy, some of which could include creating an event covered by the media, creating a website with information about the issue, blogging on the issue, or using social media like Facebook groups, Twitters, Reddits, Instagram. It's important to understand that writing it down is essential. Most of the means of advocacy require some form of written information. Some examples would be the letter to your representative or newspaper. If you were to submit a comment on a notice of proposed rulemaking, a policy brief or testimony, or even a blog would all require a quality written statement. Now, it would be important to familiarize yourself with the legislative bodies. So in New York State, we have the New York State Assembly, and we have the New York State Senate. And for federal levels, we have the US House of Representatives and the US Senate. Testimonies are written statements. You will actually complete one for one of your assignments. They are brief, about 4 to 6 pages. At the front, they present the substance of the proposal, aspect of the proposed policy that is the focus, and then your position. It identifies the basis of your interest and expertise. It incorporates some summary empirical information like data or research findings. More detail can be put in like a technical appendix. It offers a micro type story and concludes with recommendations and why these are important. There are several federal agencies that implement mental health policy. You have the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the National Institute on Mental Health, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. There's the Office of the Surgeon General, U.S. Public Health Service, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and finally the U.S. Department of Justice. There are 4 agencies that implement mental health policy for New York State. That includes the Office of Mental Health, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Services, and the Department of Health. Lastly, there are some key advocacy organizations for mental health concerns, such as the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Mental Health America, Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, the Mental Disability Rights International, the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery, and the National Coalition for the Homeless.